Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. This is our 100th program, and thank you for supporting us in our first year, and with a big thanks to all of the guests who've also appeared on the show in that time. Nobody more so than Chris Nineham, who was our very first interviewee and is also our centurion here. It's been a tumultuous year. It's been a year where internationally things have got steadily worse with more wars, and Chris is heading the Stop the War movement. So he's got that hat on, but at the same time he's also had to wrestle with the freedoms and the rights which we've grown to expect in Britain being steadily and very aggressively now being eroded and taken away. He himself was, after the very first show we did, very soon after that, he was arrested, and where the film footage that I've seen was absolutely abysmal in terms of the way the police behaved. And of course, we've got the Filton 24, who've been, of course, under arrest and basically in prison without any charges necessarily being put in, and actually no light in the end of the tunnel for many of them until last week, and there have been developments there. We've seen the Palestine Action folk being arrested, 90-year-old, 80-year-old priests and blind people indiscriminately picked up by the police because they were protesting against genocide. What is it about our society where, you can be arrested for challenging genocide, yet we can go freely letting people who commit it walk about, do what they like? There's something that's amiss. And what is it about our society where war seems almost impossible to stop because those in the Epstein class seem to profit from it primarily, and others too? Well, Chris is hopefully going to touch on a lot of these issues and try to unpack where we are and what's going to happen in the next phase of the struggle for people's freedoms and liberties. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, it was really that very first show when you were here. I remember you making a call to the police, and they were picking up on the notion of where your march should go and where it shouldn't go. And there was an objection from a synagogue there locally. And that's where the story began. And a few days later, we saw you being wrestled to the ground by the police. And your case is still going, and it's about to come to its next phase, perhaps the fruition. Tell me about this year and how it's been for you in light of all that I've said.
Well, I suppose the background to it is the absolutely unbearable reality of the genocide, which is continuing despite talk of a ceasefire. And the fact that our government continues to support Israel at a time when they have been committing these atrocities. Against that background, we have had this unprecedented movement, which is we've organised 34 protests, 34 national demonstrations, but there's been countless local protests, local marches, direct action, sit-ins, campaigning meetings, boycott actions, and so on and so forth, which is, taken together is an absolutely phenomenal mass movement on a scale that I honestly don't think there is really any historical precedent for. We may not have delivered quite the scale of the demonstrations against the Iraq War, but just in terms of the longevity of this movement and the resilience and the commitment shown by hundreds of thousands of activists, it has been absolutely phenomenal, to be honest. And of course, the other aspect to it is that it has had the support, a growing support, of huge numbers of the wider population. In fact, now opinion polls show that most people agree with us. So it's a truly extraordinary movement, and it has faced a very, very high level of repression from the police and a kind of demonisation and criminalisation that's going on, that has been spearheaded by successive governments, has been largely taken up and amplified by the media, and by the police. And we did a year ago, just over a year ago, we had this protest that was originally scheduled to go to the BBC. The police, inexplicably at the time, suddenly turned around and said, no, you can't go to the BBC, restricted us essentially to having a static protest. And then, as you say, were extremely repressive on the day. And I got arrested, and Jamal got arrested, and 77 others actually got arrested on the day. And this is part and parcel of a campaign against our movement, the like of which I have never experienced in my unfortunately quite long life of organising protests. There's really not been anything like this in my experience. And that's really what we're up against now.
Well, it's the charges that they pressed on you. First of all, just to clear up, what are they actually prosecuting you for?
Myself and Jamal are going to court for a breach of the Public Order Act, okay. Which essentially means, in this case, the claim that we took a protest into an area that was restricted, that we weren't allowed to go in.
I saw from the video footage, and the narrative that I picked up was that actually the police opened the way and allowed the protesters to go into Trafalgar Square or wherever it was that they say they weren't meant to go. So it was almost like the police facilitating it and then turning around and using it as a way of mass arresting. Did I read that right?
I don't know, but I think the key significance of this, the real importance of it, is that the restrictions that were placed on this protest and have been placed on all the protests in one way or another since last October constitute a massive ramping up of a general campaign against protest. I mean, when we had the Iraq War protests, when we had previous protests, we've never had this level of the use of public order legislation to limit our capacity to demonstrate in different places. And it's almost got to the point now where you feel as if you have to get police permission just to have the right to protest.
Yeah.
In the past, and I've been involved in negotiations with the police over these demonstrations since the beginning of the century. In the past, we said where we wanted to protest. We talked about any practical difficulties there might be with that particular operation, and it went ahead. Now it's like, oh no, you can't go there. Oh no, you can't go here. I'm sorry, you won't be able to. And this is, as I say, getting to a situation where police permission is required, and we're drifting into a very dangerous area here. We're moving in the direction of a state that is, regulating and controlling what should be a human right, the right to take to the streets, the right to assemble. These are things that are held very dear in this country, and rightly so, because actually they are the key and the source of many of the gains that we've made in society over the last few hundred years. And so I think it's a very, very serious situation, and it's one we do have to challenge.
Well, it does seem like there are a lot of inconsistencies. The government seems to be reveling in the idea of grabbing more powers. They seem to not necessarily create new bills, but they just seem to add to the things that are already there and add new ways of tightening people's right to protest. I'm referring now to the protests led by the Defend Our Juries fraternity, where they actively get their, following to put up posters or insignia which actually supports openly Palestine Action. Now, that's been very controversial because Palestine Action, of course, did commit, and they openly say they've committed certain acts of criminal damage to buildings which are in the possession of the Israeli armed forces or arms companies that supply weapons to the IDF and to the Israelis. And the attacks on those buildings and the government's attitude to that, and the case that has ensued, where, of course, Filton 24 and many others have all been, sitting around wallowing in prisons. Many have been on hunger strikes, nearly died. Several of them were at the point of death. So people are feeling very passionate about it, but the government seems absolutely hell-bent on continuing to repress and suppress and to continue to develop this totalitarian sort of surveillance society they seem to be quite keen on. What's the ability to push back? Because we know the judges, for instance, on the Palestine Action case, they've said that it should not be prescribed, but yet didn't de-prescribe it, and the government is now going to do this appeal. So there's an ongoing battle, isn't there? And where do you see this all heading? And what do you think of the government's role in all this?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to say there is a big debate and an argument going on in society about these issues, and I think where they stem from is that the vast majority of the population here and around the world understand that atrocities are being committed and don't like it. And actually a huge section of society wants to do something about it to try and make it stop. And, I found Wes Streeting's revelations about his text to Peter Mandelson very interesting here. It showed that even, quite conservative government ministers or sort of moderate to right government ministers in their, in private were prepared to accept, as he did, that Israel was committing war crimes and so on and so forth. So, I mean, everyone knows what's really going on. Sure. But the British establishment is historically and up to the present time deeply, deeply committed to supporting Israel. It's part of their, it's a central part of their foreign policy, and it's obviously connected to their relationship, their tight relationship to the US. For both the US and for Britain, Israel is a kind of important component in their ability to have influence in the Middle East and help to control the Middle East, which is obviously important to them for oil. So it's kind of baked into the DNA of the British establishment that they have to continue to support Israel. At the same time, they're massively losing credibility on this issue. So that leaves them in this situation where their kind of last resort is just to suppress and to repress. And that's really what's going on here. And that's the reason why they're turning reality on its head, and they're calling direct action campaigners terrorists, and peace marchers hate marchers, and rock bands and musicians as being somehow enemies of the state. That's the cause for this kind of massively distorted way in which they understand the world, or they're trying to present the world. And also, it's the root cause of why they're being so repressive and resorting to these kind of police measures to actually deal with what is entirely peaceful, entirely legal, entirely sensible protest, which actually represents the opinion of the vast majority of people. So it's a deep sort of social clash going on here. And it's very hard to predict how it's going to turn out. But obviously that's the context in which our case is taking place next week.
Yeah, it does concern me that, of course, this kind of bias or prejudice within the government based on their foreign policy and their economic interests, as they would argue, which mean that they want to continue using Israel as their warship in the Middle East, a kind of a land-based warship, as I think the Americans often say, even. So that being the case, it means there's a case of economic interests for somebody against the rights of ordinary British citizens. In that situation, you'd have thought that the British government would actually be really, in a position where they would have to side with British citizens. Given that also the British citizens, as you say, I think something like 70% don't want any or didn't want the war on the Gazans to take place, or the genocide, or certainly the genocide. Overwhelming majority of people did recognise it and are against it. Yet the government has pressed on, and I'm kind of concerned that the links that go. You mentioned Peter Mandelson, and that's an important one to talk about, because Keir Starmer was personally involved in making sure that Peter Mandelson was adopted. The media itself all feted Peter Mandelson, even though he was once recognised as being the master of the dark arts. Yet most of the British media was fawning over him and openly celebrating him and saying how great he was. And that now is, of course, in reversal, because Mandelson has been outed within the Epstein files more and more, and now it's getting harder and harder to justify his position. So you suddenly see that media class and that political class beginning to retract and withdraw. Yet they still, it's these same people, the Mandelsons of the world, the Epsteins of the world, linked to Mossad, the link to all the intelligence agencies, that have been driving a lot of the policies. We've also discovered more and more through the work that people at Loki and Double Down News and others have been doing, that there's forensic evidence to suggest that Israel is very much influencing our domestic policies and how we run these protests. So it seems as though there's also a crisis in the credibility of our democracy as a result of all this. And if that continues, what do you think is likely to happen? Because people are losing faith, both in America, I see, and in Britain, in terms of thinking, well, do any of these governments actually represent us?
Yes, I mean, there's obviously a pre-existing crisis of legitimacy of the, of the Westminster elites, and a real anger against politicians who people rightly, in my opinion, see as being self-serving and hypocritical and not listening to the concerns, or not really worried about the concerns of ordinary people. They're feathering their own nests. They're appeasing Trump. Trump is very unpopular in this country. 75% of the population think that he's, objectionable. And yet none of the political parties, none of the mainstream political parties anyway, in any way reflect that opinion. So what we're seeing is that the way they're behaving, the kind of more and more repressive tactics towards protest, towards freedom of speech, towards anyone who dissents from their line, and the doubling down on support for Israel and a more and more aggressive foreign policy, the attempt to get us to believe that the big problem in society is Russia or China or whatever. All of these things are, I think, deepening the sense of crisis or deepening the sense of alienation that people feel towards the politicians. So the way that plays out is hard to predict, really. But I do think the fact that a jury refused to follow the judge's instruction or suggestion that they should convict the first 6 of the Filton 24, the fact that the courts upheld the judicial review over the banning and prescription of Palestine action. I think all of these things do suggest that the kind of popular opposition is having an impact, even in parts of the establishment. I guess there's a huge amount of discomfort and anxiety, even in the top levels of the civil service and the judiciary and the legal system and so forth, because it's becoming so blatant that decisions are being made on the basis of support for Israel, decisions are being made on the basis of the special relationship with Washington, as I say, there is this kind of kowtowing to Trump, this drive to war. All of these things, I think, are the more far-sighted elements of the establishment are going to realise that these are not good in terms of the sort of credibility of the elites. So I think there's a debate going on at that level of society, and I think because there is also a mass movement on the ground, I think we have the possibility to push this back, but I don't think it's predetermined. Yeah. I thought what happened, just to say, I thought what happened in the States recently in Minneapolis was very interesting, where you have this incredibly deep-seated popular movement against ICE, which was also, by the way, making links to Trump's war.
Yes.
And because it was such a powerful movement and such a kind of courageous movement and so well organised, it did actually, in the end of the day, lead to the withdrawal of ICE from Minneapolis and the opening up of real splits even in the Republican Party. So, I think we do have the capacity to push this back, but on the other hand, it's a very, very threatening and dangerous situation.
Well, Shabana Mahmood, of course, in answer to the judges who said that it was wrong to proscribe Palestine Action as a terrorist group, has doubled down and is actually going to appeal. This is a person who was actually pretty pro-Palestine not so long ago in her life before becoming part of the upper political establishment. You've got people like David Lammy who are also doubling down in terms of trying to get rid of juries. And these are two very concerning things that the government sometimes it looks like they almost revel in the pushback that they receive as well, because they use it as a way of saying, oh, well, look, we told you so. Look, there's all this violence going on, all these protesters, and it's all very inconvenient, costing us lots of money, and they're actually supporting terrorism. And at the same time, the hypocrisy becomes even more manifest when there are figures now coming out of over 2,000 IDF soldiers, British citizens, who've served in the IDF during the genocide. And on that score, they've got a free pass. There's not even a questioning. The police don't question, the government doesn't question. And of course, that makes it even more difficult to bear that there are individuals with consciences who are were virtually on the death row in terms of hunger strikes, and the government took ages before they even acknowledged anything around it. And yet there, on the other hand, we have got British citizens who are basically patted on the back, allowed to go and kill little children or participating in the murder of women and in a genocide. And then they come back to Britain or America, etc. And nothing is said, because around the world, it's apparently 50,000 plus citizens from Western countries or foreign countries have been a part of the IDF genocide. That again, also, I mean, that can't sit well with the Stop the War movement or anybody who's against the kind of oppression. And it also doesn't give much credibility to the West when it talks about, say, for instance, is the Islamic Republic of Iran in terms of human rights and criticizing their governments and calling them regimes and saying that they're part of some sort of evil empire, while at the same time we're doing all this. I mean, where does that leave the establishment?
No, I agree. I think it's very, very problematic for them. Maybe they're reveling in it. I don't know about the individual psychology, but I don't think they should be, because I think the double standards are just becoming very, very clear to people. I mean, around the Epstein case, I was just thinking about this earlier. Not one person has actually faced or actual criminal charges coming out of the recent allegations. It's hardly being discussed, even whether they should or should not. Yeah. We have a situation where, it's the ICC is saying there's a plausible case for genocide, yet our government continues to supply weapons to Israel in the midst of it. And again, there's no talk about any kind of accountability for that. While on the other hand, you have people who are protesting, thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are protesting for peace against the systematic elimination of children and families and refugee camps, against the destruction of a whole health system, the absolutely unbearable misery that has been unleashed on the population of Gaza, who are being criminalized and are being demonized as somehow an enemy within. I mean, it's a real operation, but I think it's an operation that is just completely threadbare. And, I think it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more people, actually, that there's something very, very rotten here, and that the level of double standards is almost psychopathic. And so, yeah, I think it's as I say, it may be that there are some people in the establishment who enjoy this stuff, but I think it's a problem for them. But of course, the more it becomes a problem, the more they're likely to resort to increasingly authoritarian tactics. And this is all not unconnected with, clearly, the rise of far-right organisations, the rise of kind of irrational reactionary politics, which just is about trying to clamp down and trying to, crush dissent in every corner of society. So it's a real moment of danger. It's a real kind of moment of decision for societies, I think, not just in the US, although they are obviously ahead of us in a bad way, but also in Britain and other countries. And I think it's absolutely vital in these circumstances that we do stand up and oppose it, and make sure that we don't let this roller coaster continue to ride over our rights.
It's fascinating how all these things are connected, and joining the dots is very, very important. In the old days, I guess people liked to compartmentalize issues, but this issue of demonstrating for rights and protest and the genocide, and then looking at American policy or British policy, or even looking at the economic decline here in Europe and the immigration issue, you rapidly begin to realize, actually, it's all quite interconnected. It all plays off each other. And then there's the government, of course, which is hell-bent often on doing things which are clearly not in the interests of the British public. And I'll talk about Ukraine and the war on Russia, or even the support and for the drums beating for the war against Iran. Suicidal wars, both of them, both from an economic perspective, but also from a military perspective, from all the analysts I've heard. Yet the governments that we've got in place, and even the ones in opposition, seem to be still committed to these diabolical kind of policies, which are going to clearly take us down a rabbit hole of economic, inflation and struggle and strife and more poverty. I'll just give you one statistic that I've come across. The British government has already, over the last, I think, 20 or 30 years, spent £80 billion pounds plus in terms of military, their spending on military, on all these various wars from Afghanistan to wherever. And now they are saying that they want to, even murmurs of conscription and preparing the ground and the mindset for British youngsters to be ready for war and for us to go onto a war footing with Russia. And it seems as though it's pretty clear to me that the Ukraine issue, whilst there is a dispute there between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and there was a genuine dispute, but there were many opportunities not to let it get out of hand and turning into the kind of thing it has become, which is a bloodbath. There's a bloodbath there going on. And of course, the fact that now we want to spend even more money while our economies are basically breaking down here. We want to spend more money on fighting more wars, both in Ukraine and beyond. It's madness, surely.
Yeah, it is. It is. And as you say, Keir Starmer has now announced that he wants to accelerate the move towards a 3% spending on weapons at a time when, the child in the street knows that hospitals are falling apart, the education system is in crisis, social care is in tatters, that people are crying out for more money to be spent on our infrastructure, on the things that actually people need. The one thing they're prepared to increase spending for is the military, is the arms industry, is the weapons of mass destruction and so forth. And I think, this is an absolute disaster. I think where it comes from, and it's important people recognise this, that it comes actually out of really the decline of US power internationally. It comes out of the fact that economically the US and the other Western powers are more and more challenged by emerging economies, including most importantly China. And their response to that is to lash out and to try and deal with it as a military problem rather than as a problem of how can societies live together around the globe, in a way that actually provides safety and security. So they talk about security, they talk about, the challenges, and they talk up the threats as if Russia is going to invade Britain. I mean, the Russian army, and we opposed from the start the invasion of Ukraine, but the Russian army can't even get to Kiev, let alone any other part of Europe, or laughably the idea that they could they pose a kind of military threat to Britain. So there is the response to a more and more kind of contested world is absolutely catastrophic. And what people really want is the opposite. They want a move towards more diplomacy, towards resolving issues through negotiation, and towards dealing with the real problems that people face. And the real problems we have with security are to do with housing. They're to do with our health. They're to do with dealing with old age people, dealing with the problem of, child sexual abuse, these kind of issues. Those are the things that need to be addressed. Our governments aren't interested. And so, I think it's a question of what kind of priorities do we want to direct things in the future. That's what this is really all about. And there's a huge kind of divergence between what the governments are saying and what ordinary people feel. And we've got to make sure that, we kind of impose popular priorities on them before it's too late.
So your movement, the Stop the War, is probably one of the most effective in mobilizing grassroots, action. There is, of course, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and there are others that also ally with you that all are involved in this. And the left in general was always fighting for a kind of an opposition to imperialism, by and large, even during Wilson's time. They didn't go into the Vietnam War, for instance, openly with the Americans. And there was a degree of pushback. People like Tony Benn spoke very passionately, and Michael Foot, and I remember many other politicians with integrity and with some values and with some independence and actual political acumen used to exist. I see the political field now filled with people who are almost like, they're kind of automatons almost. They've been programmed by some sort of hierarchy which gives them a line, and then they follow that line. And there's within that the death of democracy almost is being engineered. And if it is the grassroots that perhaps could change this, do you think the vote will be able to influence this, or does there need to be something more revolutionary in Britain? Because even the left is struggling now to put up an opposition to all this, because you've got a fragmented traditional left. You've got a left which is Labour, which is really centrist Tory, as we used to know it, I would say. And then you've got the Green Party, which is emerging, but is now going to be embroiled because of their stand on things like anti-Zionism and things like that. It seems very easy to break the anti-imperialist movement and to divide them and to get them all to fight each other. And of course, I haven't mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and the Your Party initiatives. Do you see the left as being capable of being a bulwark against all of this, what I see is totalitarian surveillance capitalism and techno-feudalism that is rising? And I link that to the Epstein class, the paedophiles and all the other people who are now being outed as well. So there's this kind of morass and this malaise, this kind of virtue ethics malaise almost within our politics and our economics and beyond. Can your movement diversify beyond, say, stopping the war alone and a single issue, and become much more of an issue which much more of a movement which takes in all of the issues which we've been talking about in this program?
Well, I think that because there is this massive gulf between what the vast majority of people want and what is being delivered by the politicians, I think it's almost inevitable that at some stage there will be the development of a kind of coherent left alternative that I think can be very, very successful. I think your party had the possibility of real breakthrough quite quickly, given the amount of enthusiasm there was when it was first launched. That, unfortunately, has been dissipated somewhat. Hopefully it can be salvaged. But it showed the possibility there was for a new initiative. So I think that will emerge at some stage, hopefully sooner rather than later. The Green Party is at the moment kind of channeling a lot of that feeling. I don't really have a huge amount of confidence in the Green Party to be able to express it in a clear and principled way, partly because I think they are very confused and compromised over the foreign policy questions, over NATO and over the war in Ukraine, even over Palestine, to be honest. But I think we'll have that, some kind of new development will have to come. What I would say, though, is that I think it's easy to discount or to underplay the importance of the big protest movement and the campaigns. Because if you think about it, your party wouldn't have even been a thing if it hadn't been for the Palestine movement. I mean, it became a possibility because of the fantastic election result of the 4 pro-Palestine plus MPs who got elected at the last general election in 24. And that itself was a product of the inspiration of the movement. So I think we need to cling on to that and remember that, clearly we need to get our act together electorally. But these big movements, they do shape society in quite deep ways.
Yeah.
And, the fact that there is such a strong anti-war sentiment, anti-war mobilisation, pro-Palestine mobilisation, which is a product of all sorts of different organisations, in particular the 6 organisations that have been calling the national demonstrations. That's a very big source of hope, and we shouldn't underplay the importance of that. And I think it's forced the government onto the back foot. It's created a situation where they've had to say they're going to recognise Palestine. It's forced them into a situation where they've had to condemn, at least verbally, what Israel is doing. It hasn't done enough because we're still in a situation where they're funding Israel. But nevertheless, imagine a scenario where those protests hadn't happened. It would be a very, very different world. And, our pushback is, it shapes the way, it helps to shape the way things are thought about in society. And I think it's very, very important. So I don't think people should be, it's a very challenging situation. It's a very frightening situation. And it's quite upsetting. But I also don't think we should feel as if we're completely beleaguered. I think we have made an impact. We have made some progress. Mm. The fact that we're debating what's going to happen in this court case, the fact that the Palestine Action people, the decisions are, at least the argument is in play in society, that shows that this movement is really making waves. This movement really has a real purchase on the situation, and we need to hold on to that as we go forward.
Yeah, well, my final thought is about the potential for World War III, and Stop the War, of course, its priority is more often than anything else to prevent war happening or to create the circumstances where war is averted. And you did it with Syria, you did it with, of course, the Palestine scenario. It doesn't always stop the war, but it certainly puts the pressure and puts the heat on the government. I'd agree with that. And now we're faced with, of course, first of all, Trump trying to lead our establishments and Europe also into justifying the the kidnap of Maduro and the pressing down of the Western Hemisphere and the threat to Greenland, which is a direct threat to, again, NATO and Europe, you saw these kind of scenarios, which also could become excuses or reasons for battlegrounds to open up in areas we didn't anticipate. But the most obvious one to me, which is forming the biggest threat, is the drumbeat of war against Iran. And of course, Iran's an interesting one because there's a lot of propaganda, perhaps you could call it, certainly Iranian International, and a lot of investment by Western intelligence agencies in portraying Iran in a certain way, in a way which is almost like it's alien, it's a foreign thing, rather like Iraq and Saddam in that sense of it's okay to kind of attack them because they're not the same as us and they've got some issues which are fundamentally different. Maybe Islam, maybe their government, maybe their system. All of these things are touted, and there's a large movement pushing for war, even now, knowing full well that Iran is not. It's not Venezuela. It's not the resistance movement in Palestine. These guys have hypersonic ballistic missiles. They have the capability of wiping out Tel Aviv. They have the capability of maybe triggering the Samson option from Israel if things got worse. They've got the capability of shutting down the Hormuz Straits and basically plunging the entire global economic scenario into one of even worse economic disaster. And yet we still have negotiations going on between America and Iran in which warships are the first means of diplomacy. So gunboat diplomacy is going on, while at the same time you've got the notion that the NATO and the West, etc., want to come to some agreement. It seems perplexing that they're willing to go this far. And what's your prediction around this? Do you think we're going to have war? And what's the position of Stop the War on this?
Well, I mean, the position of Stop the War is that we're 100% against any kind of intervention, and we're against the sanctions on Iran, clearly, just as we are against those kind of actions on other countries that are being threatened, whether it's Greenland or Cuba or anywhere else. I mean, I think that what is driving this is a kind of desperation on the part of the Trump administration and the American establishment that broadly supports, on the whole, Trump's approach. I think they feel, it's about competition. It's about competition with China fundamentally, which they feel they're losing economically, and they therefore want to push back militarily. That's what's going on here, and that's what's driving them to these more and more irrational decisions when it comes to the actual future of humanity.
Yes.
And we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which that economic competition is capable of pushing these kind of crazed establishment people into making absolutely deranged decisions. And we see it over a whole number of different things, including their attitude to climate change, and so on and so forth. And it is, it's very, very frightening. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anyone can predict actually what this administration is likely to do. What I would say, however, is that I think it's important to register that this is a sign, this is a product of weakness in a sense, because what it tells you is that they haven't really got the political option of sending in soldiers and troops and boots on the ground in the way they did over Iraq. It would simply be too unpopular. I think domestically, there's no way that could happen. And so, it's all about leverage. It's all about threat. It's all about trying to do what they did in Venezuela, which is essentially a decapitation. That they can deliver, although it would be incredibly risky. I think anything much more than that is something that they would be very worried about doing. So therefore, there are constraints on what they can do. And, it may be that they want to bully the regime into making the maximum number of concessions they can get away with. So I wouldn't say that, it's kind of an open question as to where this actually ends up. But what is for sure, it's incredibly dangerous. The one thing I would end with is that this turn towards kind of unilateral, naked gumbo imperialism is very, very frightening. It's incredibly dangerous. It can lead us into places that we really don't want to go to. But at the same time, it is literally draining support away from the West. In the global South, across the Middle East, literally around the world, people are looking at the Trump administration and thinking this is absolutely unbelievable and absolutely intolerable. But even in the West, that's the case as well. And we shouldn't forget that. In Britain, when asked if they invade Greenland, should we kick out all US bases and all US service people from Britain, 75% of the population said yes.
Wow.
So, the nakedness of it is very, very dangerous, but it's also exposing the power relations here. It's exposing the madness of what these people are capable of doing. And that, at least in a very, very challenging and disturbing situation, that at least gives us the opportunity to build resistance and opposition that I think can be very, very powerful.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for a very thorough and very broad-ranged evaluation of where we are. And it's interesting how linked all these things are: our domestic policy, our economic policy, even our culture, our ethics, combined with our foreign policies. It's all part of the same melting pot, and Stop the War obviously has to deal with all of these things. And we wish you well, and we wish you success in continuing to mobilize the masses and maybe even expanding the range of issues that you're able to educate people and to get them to fight on. As for what will happen, it really is very unpredictable. You've got psychopaths and depraved folk that we've all now witnessed, and we're all in shock. Most people are in shock with the Epstein files and know that it has far bigger implications than just these people doing the disgusting and vile things that they've done with children, because it seeps through to their attitude in terms of, I think, what they dictate governments to do. And of course, we know that Klaus Schwab has talked about he's talked about the notion of creating a corporatocracy, a stakeholder capitalism. So the economic interests of these big guns who've been caught out, often I call them the Epstein class now, and politicians like Keir Starmer, who also was head of the CPS when Jimmy Savile was given carte blanche, it seems. So to me, and a man then who brings in Mandelson as well, it seems to me there is a moral and virtue ethics issue right at the heart and right at the top of our political class. And I think that's something that we need to address at our MPs level, and to give them the heat that they need in order to say, look, buck up. You need to come clean and where your ethical stances are. And if your own parties aren't doing the things that we're asking them, then we're not going to vote for you, and we're not going to vote for the guys who are also probably along the same lines, whether it's Reform or all the right-wing parties that are popping up, which most likely will come to power here in Britain next. We don't know, but it's very, very likely. So it looks like it's on the cards. That we need to send a clear message to these people that they need to be accountable to us, the citizens, not to the paymasters and the money men whose boards they often occupy and are given nice sweetheart deals after they've left their positions as MPs. This kind of this incestuous relationship between the media class, the political class, and I guess these money mafias that definitely now exist. We can see them all, Palantir, through to people like of course Mr. Thiel, who runs that, and Mr. Musk, who's interfering with politics left, right, and centre, and others. They're not disconnected to shaping our future, and they're not politically elected by us. Yet they're having a massive influence, and our political class and our media class is allowing them to do that. This is a major problem for any democracy, let alone one which purports to be the figurehead and the lead in democratic, if you like, institutions around the world. Thank you once again, Chris, and do like, share, subscribe. so that we get this voice out far and wide. We need these kinds of voices which are often not entertained by mainstream legacy media, precisely because they tell the truth, precisely because they're directing people to what should really be happening. We need them to be supported, Stop the War. We need our channel to be supported so that we can continue to act as a deterrent for the kind of really nonsense policies and dangerous policies that increasingly we're seeing. Thank you very much for watching.